Greetings, it's your host, Gabe Morales. Today we're going to discuss the actions of some very crooked New Orleans police officers that took place almost 20 years ago, and how events that occurred way back then still impacts the city today. Now, most of you already know, I'm quite the history buff. I like to know some of the background of things way before they occurred that may be relevant to more focused subjects. New Orleans PD was formed by French colonists before Louisiana was even part of the United States, when crime reached such great proportions that city officials felt such a force was needed. By 1817, there were 46 commissioned officers on the force. This was only 5 years after Louisiana had been made a state in the Union. New Orleans has long been divided by class and by race. And in 1866, New Orleans PD had to put down a race riot. The Civil War had only ended 1 year before, and many of these free blacks were former Union soldiers who were upset at the implementation of the black codes by Southern government officials. And many of these Southern who are white had fought with the Confederate side during the war and were angry at black, who they felt were trying to take away some of their privileges. It was reported that New Orleans PD fired indiscriminately on the crowds on both sides in order to restore order, and Union federal troops entered the city and arrested many whites as martial law was declared. It is estimated that anywhere between 34 to 200 blacks were killed and only 4 whites. A popular New Orleans police chief, David Hennessy, was responsible for bringing many criminals to justice, including a notorious Italian criminal named Giuseppe Esposito. He also arrested feuding members of the Provenzano and Matranga crime families, and although the culprits in his death were never brought to justice, many suspect it was one of these 2 crime families that had him gunned down with sawed-off shotguns. Hennessy was assassinated on October 16th, 1890, when he was only in his early 30s. Quite a few Italian suspects were arrested for his death. And on March 14th, 1891, approximately 5 months after his death, a rowdy New Orleans mob broke into Parish Prison and lynched 11 Italian inmates who had been arrested. There was little evidence in the case. In fact, 6 of these individuals had just been acquitted at trial. And although the Black Hand and Sicilian-American Mafia Impact was born in New Orleans, there are a lot of prejudice against any Italians, even if they were good citizens. Some of the alleged individuals involved in this lynching even included John M. Parker Sr., who later on became Louisiana's governor from 1920 to 1924, and Walter C. Flower, who became the mayor of New Orleans from 1896, just 5 years after the lynching, and held office until 1900. It should be noted that the Big Easy, as New Orleans is called, has long been steeped in political and criminal corruption, as well as civil rights violations. I mentioned some of this on this channel in an episode called Southeast U.S. Gangs, and more details are included in my book, Dixieland Gangs and Disruptive Groups, Crime and Impact on the Southeast United States. Hunter Gator Glass is actually from the New Orleans area, and he wrote the foreword of my book. His grandfather told him once that crime and politics go hand in hand in New Orleans, and that it was very hard to separate the two. According to his grandfather, many powerful men, besides the 2 I mentioned, jumped in, rallied, and escalated the mob. And they did so without many problems. Who was going to arrest men of such stature? And jailers did not put up much of a resistance, because they felt the mob was going to get revenge on the killers of their chief, many of whom they felt got off the hook too easy. And so you might ask, why else would they do this? Well, the short answer is that powerful people, the rich and politicians, almost always have dirt on them. And many of these individuals were believed to have been associates of the mafia, who they knew were involved in illegal activities, who made a lot of money for them via payoffs and corruption, which, if discovered, could result in a big scandal. Lynching them or rushing them to the gallows meant no further trials, whereby people might hear about their crooked dealings with them. So Gator's grandfather felt that in one act, in one big swoop, they could clear all their past debts and keep their secrets, taking them to the grave. Now that we heard a little background history on New Orleans PD, let's get to the main subject today. Hurricane Katrina was a devastating storm that occurred from August 23rd to 31st in the year 2005. That resulted in an estimated 1,000 to 1,800 deaths. These mainly occurred in New Orleans, which took a direct hit, and in the state of Louisiana, but the neighboring state of Mississippi also was hit hard. The hurricane caused anywhere between an estimated $100 to $150 billion. This would be the equivalent of over $200 billion today. Hurricane Katrina was the fourth biggest storm on record in the United States. The majority of property damage and loss of life was due to poorly designed and poorly maintained storm walls and levees meant for flood protection. And as these man-made constructions failed, floodwaters damaged tens of thousands of homes, businesses, cars, and other property, and left an approximate 3 million people in the greater New Orleans area without electricity, some for several weeks. After the hurricane, many people left the city, never to return. People soon became desperate, taking whatever they could. And some people took advantage of the situation by selling things like drinking water far above the regular market price. The situation quickly became very ugly and out of control for law enforcement.
These troops know how to shoot and kill, and they are more than willing to do so if necessary, and I expect they will.
On August 28, 2005, New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin announced that the Superdome, where the New Orleans Saints played, would be used as a public shelter. Initially, approximately 10,000 residents, along with 150 National Guardsmen, sheltered in the Superdome. Security checks were conducted. Major General Bennett C. Landreneau of the Louisiana National Guard soon stated that the crowd inside the Superdome nearly doubled in size as search and rescue teams brought more and more people to the Superdome. People were hot, irritated, and for some, it was hard to breathe. Tempers began to flare. People became more desperate. Food quickly became rotten inside refrigerators since there was no electricity to keep them cool. There was not enough restroom facilities, and those that were there quickly became backed up and clogged. Blood and feces soon covered the facility. According to many, the smell inside the Superdome was revolting, as people were forced to urinate and defecate into garbage cans and sinks. People also vomited due to eating spoiled food. By August 31st, there were said to have been 3 homicides inside the Superdome. 2 were elderly patients who had been suffering from pre-existing illnesses, and 1 was a man who had committed suicide by jumping off from upper-level seats inside the dome. New Orleans Police Chief Eddie Compass even appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show and reported seeing little babies getting raped. To make it worse, New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin also stated without much evidence that he saw hooligans raping and killing people. Many of these rumors only added to an already terrible situation. On the morning of September 4th, 2005, 6 days after the hurricane, several members of the New Orleans Police Department responded to a call of officers being under fire. Soon it was discovered that New Orleans PD officers shot and killed 2 civilians on the large Danziger Bridge that is located just south of New Orleans Waterfront Airport. 3 officers who were involved were white or African American. These officers were named as Sergeant Kenneth Bowen, Sergeant Robert Gisevis, Officers Anthony Villavaso, and Robert Falcon. After the shots fired report was called by 911 personnel, these officers arrived in a private budget rental truck, and none of them were in uniform. They were armed with rifles, including AK-47s, at least one of which was unauthorized, and an M4 assault rifle. The 2 deceased individuals were identified as 17-year-olds James Brissett and 40-year-old Ronald Madison, and 4 other civilians were wounded. All of these victims were African American, and it was later found that none had committed a crime and none were armed. In fact, Madison was a mentally disabled man, and he was shot in the back several times. The shooting immediately caused public anger and further eroded the community's trust in the New Orleans PD, which already had a pretty bad reputation. And the public was also very angry at the inadequate federal response to Hurricane Katrina overall.
I don't think anybody anticipated the breach of the levees.
Almost immediately, New Orleans staff tried to cover up these killings and falsely reported that when the officers responded to the dispatch call, that at least 4 of these individuals were firing weapons at them upon their arrival. One witness, Casimir Gaston, described the officers lining up like they were at a firing range as the 2 men were gunned down dead. It is also stated that these officers opened fire without any warning and that they fired upon the Bartholomew family, and a friend who had been walking to a grocery store and were sheltering when the incident went down behind a concrete barrier. After officers opened fire, an individual named Susan Bartholomew had her arm partially shot off, and it later had to be amputated. Her husband Leonard was shot in the back, head, and foot, and their teenage daughter was shot 4 times. Jose Holmes Jr., a friend of the Brissettes, was shot in the abdomen, hand, and jaw. And it was later found that 2 brothers who fled the scene, Ronald and Lance Madison, were chased down the bridge by officers in an unmarked Louisiana State Police vehicle. And upon investigation, it was later discovered that Falcone had fired his shotgun from the back of the car at Ronald Madison, who sustained several wounds, 5 of them in his back that became fatal. Meanwhile, Sergeant Bowen was later convicted of stomping Madison on the back before he died, although this conviction was later overturned due to lack of physical evidence. Ronald's brother, Lance Madison, was taken into custody and charged with 8 counts of attempting to kill police officers. He was held for 3 weeks in custody before being released without any charges. No weapons were ever recovered at the scene, and like I said, both civilian and other police witnesses testified that the victims were totally unarmed. So you might say, what set off this response? Well, the investigation found out that several residents in the area had been firing off rounds into the air, attempting to attract attention of rescuers. But none of these individuals fired at officers. So obviously it was a gross case of overreaction and misuse of force. Homicide Detective Archie Kaufman was made the lead investigator in the case, but he was later found guilty of conspiring with police defendants, helping to conceal evidence in order to make the shootings appear to be justified. It was also found that New Orleans Police Lieutenant Michael Lohman encouraged officers to falsify their reports in regards to what had precipitated the shootings. The officers involved in the bridge incident were finally taken into custody on January 2nd, 2007. This was almost a year and a half after the incident, and they were indicted for murder and attempted murder of innocent civilians. Gisevius, Bowen, and Villavassel were charged in first-degree murder of Brissette, while Falcone was charged with the first-degree murder of Ronald Madison. In addition, New Orleans police officers Michael Hunter, Ignatius Hills, and Robert Barrios were indicted on charges of attempted murder of 4 other shooting victims. But on August 13, 2008, the indictments were dismissed by District Court Judge Raymond Bigelow was misconduct by the prosecution. 2 weeks later, the FBI and the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice looked into the case and vowed to take as much time and resources as was necessary to resolve the case. And eventually, in 2010, the feds garnered guilty pleas from participants in the incident and who were involved in the cover-up. In November 2011, Lohman was sentenced to 4 years in prison and 3 years of supervised release, and he was finally released in June 2015. Guilty verdicts were also handed down for Bowen, Gisevius, Falcone, Villavassel, and Kaufman in August 2011. And in April of 2012, they were sentenced by a judge, with Falcone receiving 65 years and Bowen and Gisevius receiving 40 years each. Villavassel got 38 years and Kaufman received 6 years. In May of 2012, all 5 officers appealed their convictions, stating that federal prosecutors had engaged in a public relations campaign against them. And evidently, their claims were successful because in September 2013, a judge vacated their convictions and ordered a new trial. The Justice Department took the case to the Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, but judges on that appeals court upheld this decision by a 2-1 margin. But finally, in April 2016, these 5 officers who were convicted and given long prison terms in a plea bargain decided to plead guilty to deprivation of civil rights under the color of law, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. And in return, their sentences were greatly reduced to basically time already served. But it was just not New Orleans police that were corrupt. Mayor Ray Nagin, who went on national TV and pled for more Federal Emergency Management Agency assistance, or FEMA, from the president, and was regarded as a hero after Hurricane Katrina, was himself found guilty of multiple violations of the law. In 2014, Nagin was convicted of 20 counts of wire fraud, bribery, and money laundering related to the efforts to rebuild New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Nagin had been involved in multiple New Orleans construction contracts in what prosecutors called a very lucrative kickback scheme. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison in order to pay $10 million in fines in restitution. But due to COVID considerations, Nagin was released from federal prison in April of 2020. In late 2016, then New Orleans Mayor Mitch Landrieu announced a settlement between the city and the families of the Danziger Bridge incident shootings, plus 2 different cases involving lethal confrontations between New Orleans officers and civilians during the time of Hurricane Katrina. The settlement was amounted to over $13 million in damages. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, there was corruption at the New Orleans Parish Prison/Jail in the 1800s, as it did during the 1900s, and before and after Hurricane Katrina. Most staff at the facility did not show up for work, and many who were there abandoned posts during the hurricane. Roughly 650 inmates who were housed there panicked and feared that they would drown. Many escaped, and there never was a full accounting of them, as most jail records were destroyed.
We're under our emergency operations plan, so we're only, and we've been working with the police department, so we're going to keep our prisoners where they belong.
The American Civil Liberties Union filed a lawsuit and a report in 2006 concerning evacuation mismanagement and alleged abuses that occurred. Now you might say, oh well, they got what they deserved for breaking the law. I don't know how many of you ever been arrested, but in this country, you're considered innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Many of these individuals were being held pre-trial with little to no proof that they had committed any crime, including juveniles as young as 10 years old. One 13-year-old girl that was held there had to use a restroom in front of male inmates. These are just a couple examples of things that went bad during the hurricane. I may come back and do a separate episode on that fiasco, as there's just way too much to include this time around. So, in closing, the storm that surrounded New Orleans PD was not as violent as Hurricane Katrina itself, but it still caused a lot of damage to the city and to the reputation of New Orleans PD that lasts to this very day. But we should always remember that there are close to 1,000 officers employed with New Orleans PD, and there are many outstanding officers employed with that agency who really care about people and uphold their oath to protect and serve the public gallantly. Hope you enjoyed this episode and return to view many more. For now, this is Gabe Morales signing off. Gangsters, cops, and politicians.